Welcome to everybody for the second session for the 60th Anniversary Symposium for the Fairbanks Center. I'm Mark Elliott, and I teach Chinese and Interation history in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the Department of History. I had the pleasure and privilege of being director at the Fairbanks Center for a couple of years. And I now serve as Vice Provost for International Affairs at Harvard, and I've made a stunning discovery in the last year since I took up this post, which is that, previously unknown to me, there are other places in the world to go than China. I didn't know that before, but it turns out there are other places to study. But still, I think I made the right choice many years ago when I chose to study China, although there are times when I feel that studying China is a little bit like following the Red Sox, where there's a lot of history, there's a lot of glorious tradition, it's exciting, it's all absorbing, it's like a religion, but there are times when it just breaks your heart. And there are times when you really don't know what's going to happen next year. The Red Sox lost last night. We'll see how far they get. But this is something that once you're in it, you're never able to shake it. Our panel today is titled "Politics and the Uses of History in China Today." As I was corresponding with our panelists, I realized that if I thought about this and been more careful, we might have called this the production of Chinese studies in China today, because what we're talking about history, but we're also talking about the discourse around the study of China, and particularly Chinese history, but the ways in which the debate around who gets to say what about China has begun to edge into the ways in which we interact with colleagues, the ways in which things are published, the way that social media in China, and particularly Weibo and other such platforms. Douban is another one, where the debate between the kinds of questions that we might be talking about in our seminars or in talks, including this talk today, may very well find its way onto Weibo very quickly. And then this dialogue happens in real time. And this is a different kind of Chinese studies than the Chinese studies of the era of John Fairbank, or certainly of Philip Kuhn or previous generations, when you might write a book and then 20 or 30 years would pass, and then maybe that book would be translated into Chinese. This is a different kind of engagement, one that I find very productive, very fruitful, but one that just operates on different dynamics, and it's one in which I think each of our panelists has some significant experience, and so I've asked them to join me to talk about, from their own personal experience and what they have observed, how they see political discourse, the political agenda of China today, intersecting with what we see happening in academic discourse. We heard earlier today the first panel, Professor McFarquhar in particular, discussing the contraction of space that's available, a kind of looking back to the future. And I think that in terms of where the policies that we are seeing today are headed. And I myself have the sense, I really entered Chinese studies right at the time of reform and opening, so my career pretty much spans that whole 35 years. That has been a period when there has been a gradual, I think, widening of freedoms for what people could write about, what people could talk about in academic spaces and in public spaces as well. But it's not clear to me that we are continuing to see that kind of widening, and it may be, as many have observed, a kind of contraction. We heard from a questioner, Steve Labo, earlier on, who said that people don't return his calls now. even though they used to just a few years ago. What kind of era are we in now? How does the conversation take place? And how is history in particular, and discussions around history, and discussions about how history actually should be done, how are these happening? How do we see ways in which a more politicized environment is affecting what we say, what we feel comfortable saying, what our colleagues in China feel comfortable saying? I don't know if we'll get to this in our conversation, but one term that certainly has caught my attention that's appeared in the last couple of years is this new term of historical nihilism, 历史虚无主义. Which of course was not a term that existed when I began learning Chinese. But it's appeared now, and there are all kinds of people talking about what it means, and it's a label, it seems, a pretty effective label for any kind of history we don't like. I.e. not strict Marxist-Leninist kinds of interpretations of the past. So why do we have this term? Where did it come from? This is one of the things that I've been thinking about. Again, I'm not sure we'll get there. So, but let me introduce very briefly Rowan Flad, John Hudson Professor of Archaeology here at Harvard, an expert on China's ancient past. I've asked him to talk about the Xiaoshangzhou, the Three Dynasties project. I don't know whether he's going to take that bait or not. But I think that the ancient past, no less than the recent past, is an area that has become quite politicized in many ways, connected to the reasons that I think have to do with the importance of history, as we all recognize, for all kinds of narratives that are told about modern China. Then I will ask Professor Jing Tsu from Yale University, very proud of her, a graduate of our program here, professor of East Asian languages and literatures and of Comp Lit at Yale, who will talk about the Sinophone and the ways in which discussions around the Sinophone in the 20th century and today complicate how Chinese studies gets defined. And then last, we will ask Rudolf Wagner, Professor Wagner, senior professor at Heidelberg and a longtime associate of the Fairbanks Center, to speak about something that actually came up today, the revival of traditionalism and, quote, Confucianism under Xi Jinping. As I was preparing for this, I came across some old notes that back in the day when we took notes like this in graduate seminars. This is dated February 26, 1986. It was a lecture by Rudolf Wagner at the University of California, Berkeley. I was a graduate student then. And this is a talk about the use of historical analogy for depicting the present in times of crisis. My notes here talk about the rehabilitation that had recently happened of Qin Shi Huangdi and Cao Cao and Wu Zetian. Also, Ivan the Terrible and Frederick the Great in Germany, and so forth. This is a topic that I can say with confidence Rudolf has been thinking about for 30 years, excuse me, and very much looking forward to seeing what notes I can add to this today. So I'll also add a few things here, my own experience in terms of the Qing, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So I'd like to begin by giving the floor over to Professor Rowan Flad.
Thanks, Mark. I just want to start off by saying the precedent that the first panel set today was rather impressive, and I'm hoping that my random path through the notes that I've jotted down can approach anything similar to the coherence that they provided in their 10-minute presentations. And I was very happy that you reminded all of us about the probability that much of what we have to say will immediately go on Weixing and be spread around the world, so that I can start off by saying, although I'm going to begin my comments with what will sound like a critique of a particular paper, that's not exactly how it's meant to be taken. And I say that mainly because, hopefully it'll be obvious why I say that now. I wanted to start off by talking about a paper that was published in Science about 2 months ago, 2 months and 3 days ago. And the title of this paper is Outburst Flood at 1920 BCE, Supports Historicity of China's Great Flood and the Xia Dynasty.
I saw that article.
Yeah. And for those of you who haven't, I'll read the abstract, which should only take a second. And the kind of general approach to science and nature papers is you read the abstract and then you understand what the paper's about, right? Here's the abstract. China's historiographical traditions tell of the successful control of a great flood leading to the establishment of the Xia dynasty and the beginning of civilization. However, the historicity of the flood and the Xia remain controversial. And then this next sentence is actually what the paper's about. Here, we reconstruct an earthquake-induced landslide dam outburst flood on the Yellow River about 1920 BCE that ranks as one of the largest freshwater floods of the Holocene and could account for the Great Flood. And then they go on. This would place the beginning of the Xia at 1900 BCE, several centuries later than traditionally thought. This date coincides with a major tradition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age in the Yellow River Valley and supports hypotheses that the primary state-level society of the Arlito culture is an archaeological manifestation of the Xia dynasty. It's an interesting paper. And as I highlighted in my reading of the abstract, what it really is about is dating with fairly high precision an outburst flood that can be documented in the Jisher Gorge in the upper reaches of the Yellow River, actually very far away from the Central Plains where the Xia is purported to have been situated. The argument for connection with Yu the Great and with the control of the flood has to do with an argument that says that this flood was of such a magnitude that the effects of it would have been felt for 2,000 kilometers downriver, along the river. And so really the substantive discussion in the paper concerns two sets of data. One is one are data that deal with dating the event, and that argument is based on a nearby archaeological site that was called Lajia, which has also been in the news over the years because it's sometimes articulated as the Chinese Pompeii. It was a site associated with the Qijia culture in northwest China, which broadly dates to the period between 2200 and 1600 BC, and this particular site was flooded and covered by earthquake-induced landslides, and individuals were buried in their homes, some clutching each other. Archaeologists have found the skeletons of individuals, and preservation that's unusual for this region and for settlement sites in general. So it's a very interesting and important site. It's also where the first noodles have been discovered that also got a lot of media a while back. Excuse me. And so at this particular site, there are some cracks that are argued to have been induced by the same earthquake that caused this landslide that then resulted in a backing up of the Yellow River and ultimately this outburst flood. And then those cracks were filled in by the sediments that are argued by the authors to be related to the flood. And so one of the whole, and then the chronology is based on dating of individuals within that context who therefore died at the same time and can be used to create a very high precision date. The other aspect of the scientific analysis relates to the scale of the flood, which is calculated based on the sedimentation rates attributed to the flood event, and the size of the landside and a couple other factors. So this is presumably what the review of this paper in Science was based on, is the degree to which the scientific proposals can be supported by the evidence provided. And typical of many science reports, this is a fairly short paper, but there's a lot of supplementary material, and that's really where the meat of the data come from. However, as you'll gather from the introduction or the abstract to this paper, 5 out of the 6 sentences are about Xia and Yu the Great, which frankly, this paper actually doesn't contribute anything new to the historicity. You have to accept you have to accept at the outset that this flood and the scale of it would have then necessarily been addressed by this individual in later historical texts, to then accept that the date provided for this flooding event is relevant to dating the beginning of the Xia. And so there's a bit of circular reasoning involved in this argument to some extent, and it relates to the topic I was asked to talk a little bit about, which is the Xiaoshangzhou chronology project, which many of you may be familiar with, but in case you're not, I'll give you a very brief summary of this. This was an official project and program that was sponsored by the Chinese government in the last half of the last decade of the 20th century. And it stems from a trip by a Chinese official named Song Jian to Egypt, where he was impressed by the detailed chronologies associated with the depth of Chinese history there. And upon reflection, therefore, he was disappointed by the lack of precision in the 5,000 years of Chinese history prior to the 9th century BC, before which historians and archaeologists could only provide him with general dates and non-precise dates for rain years and so forth. And so, therefore, this happened in 1995. So in 1996, a project was created with a great deal of funding from the central government to improve the precision for a number of aspects of pre-Qin and really early Western Zhou and earlier chronology as for that part of the 5,000 years of Chinese history. This project ultimately involved over 200 scholars that were directly involved in the project, divided into 21 different research teams and 44 separate projects, all of which related to 4 main themes in improving chronological precision for this time period. One of those had to do with coming up with precise rain dates for the several rulers of the Western Zhou that predated 81 BC. There was then an effort to precisely date the year of the transition between the Shang and the Zhou. There was an effort to improve the precision of the chronology of the early part of the Shang dynasty, and then an effort to create a reasonable and acceptable chronological structure for the Xia, kind of ignoring the debate at the time and earlier and to the present of whether or not the Xia existed at all. And so one of the main reasons why this particular project has received some criticism in the discourse about it concerns the fact that once the results of the Duandai Gongcheng were published, those dates are then sort of the accepted orthodoxy of chronology for the Xia, Shang, and early part of the Zhou, and are then worked into textbooks and become the standard view of the chronology, despite the admitted, even in the project, lack of precision with much of that. Now, one can argue, and many people do argue, that it's to some extent no worse than what existed before in terms of the chronology associated with the beginnings of Chinese civilization and the dynastic cycle and so forth. And furthermore, and a lot of people, particularly archaeologists, would take this point of view that the resources then directed towards archaeology because of the Three Dynasties project were significant and actually advanced our understanding of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the sort of state-sponsored support that occurred there. However, kind of in relation to Mark's question, the question has been asked a number of times, to what extent the archaeologists and scholars of early China are expected to toe the party line when it comes to accepting these dates and so forth. It's one of a number of different projects that have been funded subsequently by the central government. Some of these are related to development processes, like the Three Gorges Dam project, the more recent Nanshui Beidao, which is related to the water movement from the south to the north, and all the archaeological sites that are being damaged by those projects. But then there are also kind of more analogous state-sponsored projects. The one major one that's recently ended was the Wenming Qiyuan, the sort of focus on the origins of Chinese civilization more broadly and trying to understand those processes, again with this emphasis on kind of an accepted, to some extent, accepted conclusion that there is a Wenming Qiyuan and we have to just understand it more clearly. The last thing I'll say, as my time is running out, relates to the topic of uncertainty and how that plays into the sorts of discourses that we're talking about and we're already talked about this morning, and related to the Xi Jinping era specifically. In archaeological practice, so I work in the Northwest on a Qijia culture site and a number of others, so related to the location where this flood seems to have occurred. And frankly, I think the much more interesting questions have to do with that region rather than the Central Plains concerning the effects of this flood and so forth. But more importantly, my project has been going on for a number of years, and we've been trying to get an excavation permit for a while. And this is part of a kind of move since the early 90s of Chinese archaeology to become more international in terms of practice and discourse and so forth. The permit for our project was just approved last year in terms of excavation, and it's one of a number that are being approved now. It seems to be, to me, that there was this period of time of great uncertainty within the administrative apparatus related to cultural heritage in China, related to the transition to Xi Jinping's government, which is not unusual. This has happened before in terms of archaeological practice. And now there seems to be, at least in this realm, a much higher degree of confidence, I think. And so that's kind of a factor, I think, that might reflect on some of the comments that were being made just a little while ago. Can I make one other random comment? This has to do with, on a kind of separate tangent, the location of discourse on topics related to early China. It's not an accident that this particular paper is in the journal Science. The real emphasis in academic archaeology, and I think this is true in lots of different fields now, is on publication not only for a Chinese audience but for an international audience, and with real emphasis on highly ranked journals such as Science and Nature for archaeology and for related sciences and social sciences. And this has been very much promoted by financial rewards for publication, by really unreasonable expectations for publication rates and types in terms of the academy in certain fields at least. And I think that this is an important point to bring up now, so maybe we can discuss a little bit more further on in terms of what the audience is, who's talking about these topics, and to whom. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much, Rowan. And I think we'll just, well, first we need to give you a round of applause. I think that the question of who's speaking and who are they speaking to, and what language they're writing in, and so forth, is indeed something that is now much more of a question for us working in Chinese studies than it would have been just, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm going to shamelessly use that as a segue to move to Professor Jing Tsu.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, 60th birthday of the Fairbanks Center. This period actually roughly coincides as well the birth and the establishment of modern Chinese literary criticism, at least in the United States. So it seems very apt to use this moment, as well at Mark's invitation, to actually he invited us to be provocative, and I like to use this opportunity to be at least forward-gazing and thinking about what Sinophone literature or Sinophone studies might do to modern Chinese literary studies in the future. So first of all, what is Sinophone? In fact, I look around the room here and I see a very good sampling of, I imagine, the Sinophone world. Very diverse Chinese-speaking, Chinese descent communities around the world gathered in one room. Sinophone, this particular term is usually used to, I think Sinophone literary studies used to translate 华语语系文学. This is something that I think David Wong will concur. We're actually having our second Sinophone conference next week here. So for the more literary treatment of this, you can come to that. But the idea really is, it sort of congealed in 2004 when it was proposed to basically to think about alternative Chinese worlds, which are not really Chinese in the sense that they may have been abroad in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, South America for 2-3 generations. And what does that broadening of scope actually does to some of our cherished assumptions about modern Chinese literature and culture? It's actually important, I think, to remind ourselves at this point that the idea of Chineseness, this very important category of cultural thought and literary thought, in some ways is kind of, I think, invented here and largely intellectual discourse, heavily colored by the 1949 divide, which I consider to have formed the very foundational pathos for all Chinese literary criticism since. So that is to say, it colored how Taiwanese criticism tend to think about its relationship to the mainland, the sense of lost, disappearing communities, displacement, so on and so forth. These are very visceral, very impassioned, pathos-written ways and frameworks in which we think about Chinese culture, and literature. So at heart, though, is this idea that who is read in Chinese literary studies, right? We don't read just anyone. You don't read someone who published in a literary supplement in Lima, Peru, right? Even though they do write there. And you don't really look at, one-off short stories in a newspaper in Macau, not really. We still read ones who are in most command of the Chinese language, right? We think of those who can write the kind of Chinese that we can applaud, that we can see shadows of even Zhang Ailing and others, the vernacular master Chinese literary tradition. We tend to think of those as the ones to read. And that is actually in part why, of all the Sinophone communities now, it really is the Chinese Malaysian writers who have emerged as sort of the new group that we tend to focus on. But if we were to carry this logic a little further, what does it mean to restrict ourselves in literary studies to only those who have mastered a particular language? Can that encompass the diverse communities out there who might not have had equal access to Chinese language education, Chinese language writing, the same institutional infrastructure, so on and so forth? And what is it about the language, the script itself, that make, I think, Chinese writers in particular, and also as readers, we tend to really have a very visceral identification with that, right? So in some ways, going against this pathos-dominant way of approaching literary studies, I like to suggest a kind of infrastructural turn. So in humanities and literary studies are these moments where we take an ontological turn or we take an object turn, where you essentially use a different kind of perspective to reevaluate and in some ways change your perspective on everything that came before. And every so often we get these turns. But one I would like to suggest is actually something quite different. I think in some ways it's so out of the range of literary studies that it might seem actually unrelated or even strange. And it's actually tied with something that is happening this month. So sometime this month, there's an unveiling of something called the Zhonghua Ziku, the China Font Bank. It basically will roll out 3,000 of a total of eventually 500,000 newly encoded characters. What does this mean? Well, it certainly dwarfs the existing size of what's available in Unicode, which is about 80,000 or so Chinese characters. So this is actually going to really increase the digital presence of Chinese scripts. But more than that, It will include 100,000 archaic or uncommon scripts from text from your era, I imagine, and 100,000 of ethnic minority scripts. So this will be the single largest state-funded digitalization project ever. But has virtually remained unknown outside of China. And even within China, I think, people have not really looked at this. It was launched about 5 years ago. And it has been, digitalization actually has been a main project, a main priority in the last 2 5-year economic and social directives. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that with this increase, so what's the consequence of the increase of Chinese characters? Well, we all know that now, even I think students in China, in some ways, pinyin is the fastest input system for typing things, writing, emailing, posting your message on Weibo and what have you. This will make certain characters even more accessible than before. For instance, even those that will prefer not to be known, such as the sort of the playful online languages like 火星字, Martian script, and I think there's one called brain damage script as well. Although I prefer the sort of someone also called the thunder script, so I prefer that. So these are ways of basically recombining Chinese characters, taking them apart, using some bopomorpho, using some alphabet letters, so on and so forth, but also using a lot of these archaic and uncommon scripts as a way of talking about certain taboo subjects. So you can imagine that, given that censorship in China works in both automated, like computer sweeps every so often, and also human censors, given that both works, you can see how it's going to make it easier with the increase of this online Chinese vocabulary. It'll be easier to track people and with their financial transactions, what they're talking about, their public words and deeds. And this has actually been talked about, has been sold as a good thing, because, for instance, there are citizens with there's a citizen with this character in this name. I imagine many of you in the room, when you have high aspiring parents with great hopes for their children, usually you have an auspicious character in your name that's difficult to pronounce, but supposed to bring you great fortune in life should you ever live up to it. So this woman had this character that is made up of, the top is dragon, the simplified form of dragon, and below it it's sky, heaven. So of course the idea of soaring dragon is extremely auspicious, but this brought her an endless grief, because her character cannot be put in properly in any of the state systems. So for instance, she's been working for 2 years, but still paying for healthcare out of pocket because she doesn't appear in the system, and as far as it's concerned, she doesn't really exist. She can't use Kuaidi, Didi, she can't use Chinese Uber. She can't really do a lot of things on the internet, basically, and have to go through tremendous trouble having to explain to them who she is and bring her ID, so on and so forth. So these 3,000 characters, uncommon characters, that's being unveiled this month, is supposed to take care of problems like that. But of course, behind us, also with every technological access comes more vulnerability. So even though the internet was created in the United States, you can be sure that its future is actually being shaped by Asia, actually China and India combined. Actually, this is there's sort of recent studies of how actually cyberspace and try to regulate cyberspace with relation to China. I mean, as you know, recently there's a lot of tense relations surrounding alleged PLA hacking, so on and so forth, that this has actually become a very difficult terrain to deal with. But it also affects us in the sense of, you can still see Chinese script, you can still use it, and it still looks, it walks and talks like Chinese language, but behind it is this new warfare that's being waged, right? Where you can actually, once you encode Chinese and you make it accessible, it's also a question of who gets to use it. Is it really that difficult to restrict its access? And what does it mean for us who write in that language to conduct literary criticism or to write fiction according to kind of much older, habituated way of thinking about Chineseness? Right? So this is a certain way, I think, in which the time-honored cultural categories have not kept a pace with a certain kind of material and infrastructural change that's actually happening right before our eyes. And in many ways, one could think about that given the expansion of internet writing or internet fiction, right? It is not the case that every writer has to be approved by me or an academic or a scholar who decides that this is a writer that deserves to be read, right? It's a much broader platform that is actually, in contrast, makes sort of, in some ways, academic studies of literary criticism much more narrow, and I think in some ways much more isolated and self-isolating. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about what the future of literary studies would be, right? Is this also, I wouldn't call it a digital term, because I think also Chinese literature comes with very particular and heavily laden social and political circumstances that will always try to harness the technological, even as it sort of threatens to outgrow. But nonetheless, I think given this occasion, I would like to just throw this question out there for those who might think that the cohesive force of Chinese communities all over the world is this idea of language and culture. And what does it mean now that Chinese language is going to be more user-friendly ever before, but also more watched than ever before? Thank you.
Thank you. I see a few students in the audience here who are probably wondering now if this means that they're going to have to learn yet more Chinese characters. That was my first thought. I've never heard of 火星字, Martian writing?
Martian,
no,
Martians.
so so many things happen first here. For how many people in the audience is the idea of 火星字? Have you heard it? Have you not heard it before? The first time you're hearing about it?
Oh, how funny. I'll send you all a text in it later.
So thank you so much. I was worried it was a risky move just now. I could have been the only one in the room, and it wouldn't have been the first time. But you heard it at the Fairbanks Center first. Just remember that. For our third speaker, Professor Wagner. Rudy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join this meeting here, and I'm a very happy member here of this Fairbank Center gang, and I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. Now, it looks as if the discussion of the fate of Confucianism in modern China is something that is essentially a kind of a China-centered affair, Confucianism, Chinese affair, revive Chinese affair. Well, that is just not how things are. As a matter of fact, Confucianism is, modern Confucianism is, in a rigid sense, an import product. And as a matter of fact, the place where you happen to sit is not totally unrelated to that. Now, let me make that a little bit clearer. The origin of the debate, as a matter of fact, is quite a while ago, namely in the late Qing, where a foreign-managed newspaper, the Shenbao, since 1872, started to develop a rather elaborate discourse which said that the Sandai, our colleague here has been talking about, the three dynasties. As a matter of fact, the ideal time in ancient China when the sage rulers were ruling had the same underlying philosophy of governance than the modern West. And therefore, adopting Western modernity was compatible with Chinese tradition. So this was directly linked with each other. Now, that has led to the next step, namely that the question came up, what then are we doing with Confucianism? Now, part of the Sandai story was that the beginning of imperial China was the end of ideal governance in China. From then on, it is basically the esprit de loi kind of despotism, and therefore this is all bad. So that story was homogenized by Kang Youwei since the late 1880s by transforming Confucius into a magical new figure, namely a Geigejia, a reformer, Confucius the reformer. And that, as a matter of fact, was patterned on a very simple model. The model was the relationship between Moses and Jesus. So Confucius came into the role of Moses, and you ask yourself now, who is Jesus? Now that's very easy. Here you have Kang Youwei coming in himself. And you have then the next effort to reset the Chinese calendar, namely away from the Christian calendar. Now you date it from Confucius' birth or death. So that is part of the kind of develop a nativist, authentic Chinese discourse there. But that was not the end of it, because the connection of this Confucian doctrine with the modernity was still contested. I mean, the main engineers of bringing in modern knowledge, as a matter of fact, in the late Qing were Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, and people like that, who were at the one time, doing this Confucian advocacy, setting up statues of Confucian in school, founding a society in East Asia, and I don't know what. But they also had the Baohuangdi Hui, the association to preserve the emperor. So they were Qing loyalists. And that did not bode well for Confucianism. The effect was that in once the Republic was there, the notion came about that something like a fundamental break had to be made. And that was based on a number of other import products. The first import product was Wilsonianism, namely sovereignty and so on, First World War. The second import product was Karajan and Borodin, namely Marxism. The third import product was Dewey with his pragmatism. So you had a number of other ideologies coming in. That is congealed in a wonderful handbook, which I greatly recommend to all to read. That's the Xin Wenhua Cishu, the encyclopedic handbook of new culture. That comes out in the Shangwu Yinchuguan in 23, and then goes to, 30 editions. Now, this is a wonderful thing, because the entire Xin Wenhua terms are all Western. It's organized according to the Western alphabet. There is not a single Chinese thing in there outside of an article on Buddhism, which mostly deals with India. So the Xin Wenhua, the new culture, is Westernized culture. And that had a wonderful output a few years later, namely with the Gu Shipian series put together by Gu Jiagang. And this is a series where suddenly you come into the question of the Yi Gu, namely the Sandai he has been talking about, the three dynasties. They are just hogwash. This is just Shenhua. This is just myth. These are just invented things. The first stuff there is any mentioning of that's in the 4th century BC, so forget it, This is all Shenhua. And that, of course, copies away a discussion which goes on in the West, which has to do with Christ has never existed. So this is Jews coming up in 1909, and then a Japanese writes a book about it. Christ is just a myth, cooked together from various historical records. There is no independent source outside that little phrase in Josephus, who is an advocate of it, not believable. So therefore, the founding fathers, as a matter of fact, are just mythology, and that is true for China too. So now this ego, doubting antiquity, then it dominates the discourse down to the end of the Cultural Revolution, when eventually Feng Youlan comes on with this wonderful book, on Confucius as the restorer of slaveholding society, which made a little bit of difficulty because slaveholding society is supposed to have ended with the Shang, So what they did is basically to redate the end of slaveholding society from the end of Shang, to the end of the Western Zhou, So they made a big shift there. So Confucius would just something that restore something which before him was just 150 years before. So Confucius was in doldrums, and the main slogan was, of course, 决裂, breaking, cutting, down with it. Now we come into the 改革开放 reform area, and we have another situation, and the situation is that suddenly these small tigers in Southeast Asia come up. And the question is, how do they do that? How do these Singapore and Taiwan and South Korea, how do they manage there? So suddenly people who have no connection with that at all start talking about that must have something to do with Confucianism. So Harold Kahn in 1979 comes out with this big book on the world economy, in which he says, yes, Confucian virtues are at the basis of this economic success. And then comes Peter Berger, sociologist, who says the entire story we have all read, by Max Weber, namely, Protestantism and so on, that's all hogwash, namely, Confucianism is the better Protestantism because it does not have that kind of individualism which sets people against each other. So therefore, the modern, if we get now a Weberized Confucianism there, which is stripped of all its sort of feudal remnants, and this is really the engine of modernity. And as a matter of fact, Professor Farquhar, a dear friend and great fun to talk with him every day, has played a little role in that as well. He wrote in 1980 in The Economist an article in which he was, as a matter of fact, attributing the success of the small tigers to the Confucianism. Now, the neo-Confucianists coming up since the 80s were, as a matter of fact, very explicit in acknowledging their debt to Professor McCarker, to Harold Kahn, to Peter Berger. They were very clear that, as a matter of fact, these Western people who are not specialists, they have all said Confucianism is the engine driving us all forward. Ha! Then Lee Kuan Yew, took the next step and said, okay, let's get these guys here. So he invited, Du Weiming, who was still in Berkeley at the time, and then Cheng Zhongying, and who was in Hawaii, and Yu Yingshi, who was probably still at the Xin Asia College or already in Princeton, I don't know. Anyway, so he invited to Singapore to do what? To invent a kind of a thing which he felt was now needed, because with this economic growth, he felt the social fabric was falling apart. People were going on strikes. Young people in Singapore were not showing up for work. They were doing all kinds of things you don't do. So you need some kind of a strong educational system. Oh, in there come and write new school books on the basis of the Go report. Go is the Minister for Education there. So that is instantly copied in South Korea and in Taiwan. So you get a kind of a modernized, Weberized Confucianism introduced into these small tigers, which then led to a flood of publications which were the engines for the revival of Confucianism in the People's Republic. Now, in the People's Republic, after the Cultural Revolution, you had a similar problem, namely they had the Geiger Kaifang coming up, and you had worries and scares about growing social fragmentation. So here we get from the early 80s on, you get a discussion which is still under the shadow of this Confucianism being just the debris of feudalism, which then in the PRC consists of having foreigners coming in. So there is no Chinese Confucianist there. There is, Du Weiming coming, Cheng Zhongying coming, doing big reports. Du Weiming in 85 says, yes, the third period of Confucianism has now come, with him as the new prophet. And so now this third period then, the first one is Confucius himself, second was Neo-Confucianism and Song Dynasty, and then here is the third. So here we have now, the next stage is that the state finds, wow, there is something to be had. The discussion is still very controversial. People maintain this is all conservative. Others say this is compatible with modernity. Others say this is saving the world. This is the new teaching to save the world. And the government spotted, as a matter of fact, there is something to be had. Now, Gumu, the vice head of the State Council, decided, to put big money into Confucianism. So the 7th five-year plan, 86 to 90, had a fantastic Confucianism project. You set up, the Kunzi Yanjiuhui, and you have basically then a kind of a big market with hundreds of publications and books and reprints and something like that all over the place. So this becomes a big thing. It's managed, this big project managed by Frank Li, and the Gumo is then elevated to be the honorary vice chairman of the Kunzi Yanjiuhui. So here we have basically the state marching in, and that reduces the leeway of the discussion. Before that, you had Du Weiming talking about Confucianism, had all these dark aspects, with gender questions and so on and so forth. He never mentioned that in Singapore. So there was never a critical attitude towards Lee Kuan Yew or something like that. But I mean, there was in other writings he said that. He was very explicit about it. And there were criticisms in China. But once you get into the state system there, then you have one new thing, which is, namely, that scholars decided, okay, this is a new central line here, accommodate. So you go into the big accommodation mode, and the big accommodation mode is that now we use Confucianism as this kind of a modernizing esprit. And I remember at this conference, I was by a chance in Peking, that dragged me to come in there. Most of the good scholars were sitting outside and laughing their heads off because they felt that was all nonsense. But I remember one a colleague of mine whom I actually appreciate a great deal, he said, well, this Confucian heritage is really wonderful. It gives us a grasp, as a matter of fact, on international politics. Namely, there is in Lunyu this saying, 小人同而不和，君子和而不同。So here we have, now we are the Junzi, we are 和 so we are in harmonious relationship with all the others, but we are not the same as them. We do our own stuff, right? So here you have suddenly, a new phrase coming in, and then you have a flood of new guys coming in, Jiang Qing, and I don't know what, not the Jiang Qing you know about. This is a scholar from Nanjing, who then says, yes, of course, the women should, stay inside, and not open their mouth, and the kids should come in sort of pseudo-Joe dress into schools to learn to bow properly, and so on and so forth, about to confuse it at any beginning. So you have all sorts of antiques there, and so we have a situation which then, after the 89, is increased to a level of a kind of a state propaganda system where now the Lunyu is being interpreted in this manner on the TV. You get schools being set up, and you have again a very strong international relation. Namely, Du Weiming is of course in Peking now, and you have on the other end you have Daniel Bell sitting in Peking and is making a strong case, for a modern Xi Jinping type of governance, as the real, compared to the American situation, as the real way forward, and promoting people like Jiang Qing, who had been coming out with these wonderful stories about how women and men should behave and children should be educated and so on, publishing a translation at Princeton University Press, So you have a very nice way of this Confucianism becoming international and be going back, and with that I will end to an old story which had already been started with Kang Youwei, namely that in the Datong Shu, which came out in the 30s, was written much earlier, that, as a matter of fact, the ideology which eventually is going to save and hold together the world is this new Weberized Confucianism. And this is then coming back now with Jiang Qing even saying, yes, Marxism, Leninism is not fit for China. The real Chinese religion is Confucianism, the modernized Confucianism. And we have now a situation where, as a matter of fact, in a situation where the state is defining itself as being in a transition period, where there is a lot of turbulence, where there is a lot of insecurity, Confucianism comes in as an opportune instrument to try to secure some kind of a social and ideological stability and pride and identity. And there are substantial amount of Chinese intellectuals, among them the manager of the Sandai project, Di Xueqin, who of course has been making Confucianism into the only streamlined Chinese ideology by misreading a substantial part of the archaeological evidence of the bamboo strip finds and so on and so forth, right, to make sure that the essence of China, of the Chinese, is Confucianism, and this is an ideology which is not at all related to China, but Du Weiming has already said that, Kang Youwei has said that, it is saving the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy, as always, for just a stimulating whirlwind over the millennia. We will come back to this question, I think, at the end you raised about Li Xueqin's role in this and how academics are participating in these kinds of projects. I'm going to offer my own take on this question that we're coming at from many different angles by talking about some of the way that I have seen some of this happen in the field that I work in, which is Qing history. And again, the questions of Chineseness and how Chineseness is understood, how it's performed, how it's defined, who gets to be Chinese, where the essence lies, and all of that have been enunciated. I'm going to ask James if he can bring up the PowerPoint. Super. Okay, thanks. So, Qing history, old and new. In Qing history, there at the same, just a little after the Xiaoshangzhou project, there was another large state-funded project. I guess probably contemporaneous around the same time as this, the Huazi, Zhonghua Ziku, and that is the Qingshi Gongcheng. Right, the state council funded a complete rewriting of the history of the Qing, more or less on the basis of the way that dynastic histories get written. This began, it was in the early 2000s, and the goal was to produce over the course of 10 years a new and authoritative Qing history, because the history that had been produced before, the Qingshi Gao, was only a Gao, it was only a draft, and there needed to be a final closure on what the story was on the Qing. Unfortunately, we still haven't yet to see any of the published versions, any of the published material out of the Qingshi Gongcheng. It's undergoing revisions, and I think that certainly my conversations with the scholars who were involved in that, and many fine scholars have taken part in that, indicate that the shifting political winds of the last 5 years have made it very complicated for them, because chapters that were written 8 years ago now need to be revised. And so we have yet to see what this has produced. Another thing that has changed is that at the same time as the Qingshi Gongcheng, the Qing History project, got underway, there was another very unofficial project with no state sponsorship and very little organization and even less money that came about, and that was something called the New Qing History. The New Qing History, also known as Xin Qing Shi, involves a few things. I'm going to race through this because we have very little time, and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. These three things basically are what is involved. First of all, emphasis on the inner Asian dimensions of the Qing rule, remembering that the Qing was founded, in fact, not by Han people, but by the Manchus, using non-Chinese language sources, especially Manchu, but also Mongolian and other languages for research, and understanding the Qing as a world empire alongside other empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Romanov Empire, the Mughal Empire, what have you. So these are some of the things that the New Qing History has stressed in its various work, and out of this, this idea of the Qing as a state founded by Manchus came a question about, well, what kind of China was the Qing after all, if the people in charge were not themselves originally Chinese? If we understand the Qing as a Manchu dynasty, what does this do to the general story we tell of unbroken continuity or nearly unbroken continuity from the Xia all the way up to the present? So some of the earlier critiques, this is one of the first uses of the term, the New Qing History, article written by Joanna Whaley-Cohen, 2005, as a decentering project and trying to reorient the way that we understand China and reorient the way that we understand how Qing history ought to be approached. Something like the approach that had been brought together and characterized by Paul Cohen earlier on as a China-centered history of China. I'll explain more about this in a second. So using non-Chinese sources and this world historical context to understand the Qing comparatively and to connect the Qing with other dynasties, with other regimes. So there have been a lot of criticisms of the New Qing history that have emerged, some of these within the American Academy, many of them from Chinese and also Korean and Japanese and European scholars as well. So it's spurred a great debate, and it's been very interesting. Here's one criticism: doesn't this in fact distort the record? The New Qing history says, well, the Manchus took on some Chinese ways, but they never lost sight of the fact that they were Manchu. They didn't really become Sinicized. This has created a lot of controversy. Of course, the Manchus became Sinicized. We know they did. They disappeared after all. They fell from power. And then these Chinese language sources are not really that important, they're just translations. What about the Chinese language sources? And besides, other people, particular Japanese scholars of the 1930s, had already begun making this connection between the Qing, say, and the Mongols, or the Qing and the Mongols and the Khitans. This is a kind of questionable approach to Chinese history. Haven't we seen this before? So it emerged as kind of a challenge, I think, to some accepted narratives. What was the Qing really about? And if you start questioning what the Qing was about, and you think about the fact that modern China was built on the foundation established by the Qing, then what you also are kind of asking is, so what's China about? And that's a question that makes a lot of people nervous, for reasons that I think should already be obvious, because there are lots of questions of this sort being asked in many different disciplines. So we have a kind of what might be called a paradigm shift of sorts. This was a talk I was supposed to give in Beijing a number of years ago, and the day before the talk was canceled for reasons, as you see here, 因故取消. And I did give the talk at a different branch of the Academy of Social Sciences, and the world continued. China did not fall apart, I'm happy to say. But this was the first sign that the kind of challenge that was being proposed by taking what had been a kind of Western-centered and associated, rightly or wrongly, with a Fairbankian approach, looking at the Western role in China, to something that Philip Kuhn and my teacher Fred Wakeman and Jonathan Spence and others also moved toward a more China-centered approach associated with Cohen, and now we're looking actually at a Qing-centered approach to Qing history and not a China-centered approach. So this message got through, and over the last 10 years or so now, the new Qing history has become kind of a thing. It's on Baidu. It's on Douban. There are hundreds and hundreds of entries on Douban. There are dissertations and books being published about the new Qing history in China. And there has been also a lot of pushback from a variety of people. I'm just going to move through this very quickly, again, to give you some sense of some of the responses. To subsume all of Qing history as Manchu history and overlook the central importance of Han thought and culture, etc., is obviously to betray historical reality. One critique, here we have another one from Yang Nianqun, a very well-regarded historian, somebody who works at the Qing History Institute. The new Qing history, focusing on the frontier and on identity and ethnicity, is nothing less than carrying out an amputation on the body of traditional China. And it's to say that the frontiers are as important as Jiangnan. What an outlandish notion that is. Here, another quotation from Yang Nianqun, because, again, if we take the Qing as an empire and we think what empires do, well, empires conquer. Well, that didn't happen in the case of the Qing, because the empire was unified. It was not established or expanded through conquest. And to suggest so, as Professor Yang points out, is obviously a post-colonial illusion. So Western historians who are trying to understand the Qing operating as other empires are just barking up the wrong tree. They just don't understand China, because the kinds of things that make empires work in other parts of the world don't apply to China, because China has its Tese, it has its own special path, its own Sonderweg, and all that goes with it. So this has produced, as I say, again, a lot of interesting discursive play in China. So we have here what appear to be two different articles. One is 族群转向与近代中国的国家认同, right? And then we have 潜在的分裂意图, 美国新清史研究剖析, right? This is the same article. It's just given different titles. the publishers. One appeared originally in 中华读书报, and the other in something called 观察者 just a week later. So the people at 观察者 obviously saw something here, but they thought the title was really not that sexy, and so they decided to do something about it. And the criticisms have become more and more extreme. People are seeing in some of this research questioning the sovereignty of China. And one of a colleague at Beida has said as much as the New Qing history. People like myself, or Jim Millward, or Pamela Crossley, or Evelyn Roski, or any number of scholars, Peter Perdue, are in fact, we're working for the US government trying to split China up. Little do they know how little the US government pays attention to what historians of the Qing write. A couple of years ago, then, this began to, I've written a response to this, of course, didn't get read as widely as I might have liked, but I found myself then the object of attacks of being a new imperialist. This appeared a couple of years ago on the website of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, written by Professor Li Zhiting, a retired Qing historian. And the language here, one of my friends counted 88 exclamation points in this piece, is very cultural revolution in style, something that was remarked on very widely in the internet because there was a lot of conversation about this piece. And it sparked a number of follow-up pieces and responses. I'm just going to move through these. Some in support of what the New Qing History Project is about, others very critical. And the debate just moved off into totally different directions, and I just sat by watching this very interesting debate being carried on by colleagues in China who were clearly very impassioned about what was going on, and included scholars in Taiwan as well as scholars in Hong Kong. And then the books began to appear out of all of this, and interviews and all the rest. So I'll just get to the end here. This one is to give you some sense of how important criticizing the New Qing history became. If you want to become famous, 历史报大名的方式, first of all, 出轨, so you have to have an affair. And then the second is you need to 逐出师门, so you need to, what's the way to translate, how would we translate this? Repudiate your teacher. That was the word I was looking for. Repudiate your teacher. And then the third thing is to criticize the New Qing history, and then submit the same article to many different journals all at the same time. So, this kind of thing is appearing. And this is from last month. So this continues. The best thing I can say about it is that at least people are paying some attention to what American historians of the Qing actually have to say, which was not the case up until about 10, 15 years ago. Really not. The question that underlies it, though, is a very serious one. And the Germans, as they do, have great words for really serious questions. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, Rudy, but coming to terms with the past. How do we deal with this past? Is the Qing, Bill Kirby was saying earlier, the different levels of the museum. Bill, you were saying downstairs the Qing is a glorious Chinese past, upstairs the Qing is all bad. The National 历史博物馆, right? So, the history serves very different kinds of purposes, but it's very, very useful, similarly with language and with ideology. And I will stop there with the question that I think we all are interested in. To whom does Chinese history belong? To whom does the discourse around Chineseness belong? Is this something over which you have to be Chinese in order to be able to have a 发言权? Or is this, we say that China belongs to the world, if that's the case, then this discussion belongs to the world. If you're willing to put in the time to become a serious student of China, then do you not have a seat at that table? So I will leave it there, and I think we'll open things up for discussion. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion, and so the floor is open. Please, Mr. Keenan.
Flad, what date would you...
Let's wait for the microphone. And if you could introduce yourself briefly.
My name is Barry Keenan, and I'm an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center. What date, Mr. Flad, would you justify as the correct one for the conquest of the Zhou over the Shang, and why?
So as a field archaeologist concerned with process, I'm going to dodge. I'm actually much more interested in periods of time that are not as precise as individual events. The arguments given in the particular Duandai Gongchang results of 1046 BC relate primarily to evaluation of astronomical events in relation to textual records. And it's actually one of the few things that some of the Western scholars who are most critical of the Duandai Gongchang, and not just Western, the scholars who are most critical of the Duandai Gongchang and the formal results more or less agree upon. When I use a date for the conquest in my writing, I tend to round, because we like to round, and when you're dealing with radiocarbon dates are the sorts of chronologies that I tend to deal with, and I think about 1050 is just fine, because everybody who argues currently about the date either is using 1045, 1046, 1049, or 1050, right? And for an archaeologist and the processes that I'm interested in, it's all the same. This is, so my dodgy answer is it's around 1050 and quite possibly 1046, because a lot of people who've thought about that specific historical question and concerning that event a lot longer than I have argue that. So that's my answer.
Please.
I'm Brian Lander, a postdoctoral fellow here, and I just wanted to bring up the question of, like I study ancient Chinese history, and it's very clear that most of the interesting questions are not asked in China because it's dangerous to ask anything about politics. You know, I had people who study Song history telling me they can't talk about politics at all because it's still sensitive. So I'm just interested in the question of what is not studied because of politics in your field. I don't know if anyone has an answer to that.
What is not studied for political reasons? Of course, people can't talk about why they don't see it.
Especially when it's being recorded. No, seriously, especially because it's being recorded. I mean, as a modernist, I mean, of course, there's a whole list of things. I mean, even going back to what I was talking about, there are certain abbreviations that you just simply cannot mention, hence why these endless creative ways of referring to events. Any of those who know, 535 or ZD, or any of these, abbreviations. I mean, there are lots of ththings that we skirt around. I think it is although I do find it interesting when Mark was saying how, in some ways, your counterparts in China attack you for being a spy for the U.S. government, because actually, if anything, the U.S. people in the think tanks now in the United States are actually very cognizant of the fact that Qing Empire was different, that China bordered 14 different countries, is a fundamental geographical explanation for why its worldview would have evolved differently than the U.S., right? Which, other than north-south, is basically sea-bound and feels very much, secure, and therefore cannot imagine that in many ways China's concerns in the world can be anything but pitted against the United States, whereas China actually has historically a much broader horizon for thinking about its place in the world. But
Rudy? Yeah.
Yeah, just add a little word. I mean, evidently in the last 100 years, there are quite a lot of topics that cannot be addressed. I mean, 89, the Cultural Revolution, many aspects of the private individual lives of party leaders, and so on. So I mean, a few years ago, you couldn't sit down and write a glorious book about Lin Biao's military achievements. Now it's a little bit more difficult. So it's always depending on the political climate. But that, as a matter of fact, goes much further back, because you have certain iconic, let's say, on the typings, that is before 90, basically to deal in any serious manner with typing religion was a no-no, because this is revolutionary heritage. It's the Yingxiong Jinbei there on Tiananmen. The lowest layer there is the typings. They are the founding block of modern revolution. So you can't come in, and say this Christian religion is defined as being something like an outside code to fool the masses. They were really revolutionaries against the foreigners and against the big landlords, which is hogwash. But that is just how the story goes. So you have a lot of blank spots, but the main point, I don't think, is that. If you look into the way how Chinese history, PRC history, is basically cooked, then you have a kind of what is rightly called a kind of master narrative, which frames everything else. And scholars do very specific and solid particular research on this and that and the other, right? But they don't dare to go on the level of the master narrative of the big story. So therefore, all these things are set in. So you have on Jindaishi, as a matter of fact, you have a master narrative which actually comes from 1949, which set the basic trajectory, and then you have thousands and thousands and thousands of articles fleshing that out, and anything that doesn't fit in there is very simply not in there. And you look in literature, it's the same thing. I mean, there are certain figures with certain valuations, and then everybody goes for the same frame, and anything that's not in there is not in there. But if I may add one more sentence, I used, when I went more often to China than I do at the present moment, there were all these wonderful sanlunche on the street, with selling books. And I thought, well, these guys, you make a little calculation, they have rather small markup, something like 10%, so in order to survive, they will have to sell every book on that table something like 2 to 3 times a day. Otherwise, they can't make a living. So I just took detailed notes, what's on these tables. And now, as we are talking about history, that is really interesting. Practically every single book on these tables, these are not Xinhua Shudian people who basically couldn't care less what they sell because they are not in a business environment, right? These people have to sell. Every single book you see on these tables dealing with recent Chinese history, 20th century Chinese history, is a translation of a Western book, Fairbank and so on and so forth. There is not a single one which is written by a Chinese author. So the trust and the credibility in foreigners writing about Chinese history, as a matter of fact, is exceedingly high. And the effort to establish a kind of a master narrative to somehow get that under control is always to be seen against the counterpoise, of a deep distrust in these narratives, which, however, in a long tradition of Chinese intellectuals, you basically follow the master narrative. That is not something which you take on, or you take it on at a major risk of your life and limb.
Rowan, you wanted to add something here?
Yeah, just something related to that in terms of archaeology, because it may not be as obvious. I think that one might assume that there's a master narrative against which it's very difficult to resist, and I think that was certainly true 20 years ago in major archaeological topics. I think that's definitely not true anymore, and that so certain things such as the historicity of the Xia or the influence of the West on certain technological developments that lie at the fountain of Chinese civilization, the introduction of metallurgy and so forth. The people who are doing the most cutting-edge research undercutting this kind of traditional master narrative that's really not terribly present anymore are scholars in China, and there's funding behind that and so forth. And so I think that the answer to your question, Brian, in this case, in terms of pre-Qin archaeology, field archaeology, really relates to geography. And so the holes in in terms of archaeological research have to do with sensitive locations. And those locations are not sensitive because of the interpretation, well, not only or mainly sensitive because of the interpretations that might be the result of the research, but because of the current political climate. So Tibet, Xinjiang, less so just in the last couple of years, but for quite some time, Xinjiang has been a major example of this. But so it's kind of different from what one might expect in terms of the holes in research.
Could I ask you a question? May I do that? Just ask a question here.
Be short, because we have.
Yeah, I'm amazed at what you're saying, because my understanding was that, as a matter of fact, one of the main effects is that China, with this Geiger Kaifang, started to reinvent its own history and rewrite its master narrative, saying, yes, we have always been open to the world. So suddenly, Tung and Jung couldn't write, his three sources of Chinese tradition. They couldn't publish it in China, publish it here. 10 years later, 15 years later, it became a master narrative. Yes, there is not only one center of Chinese cultural origin. There are many different ones, and they interact, something like that. So I think you get an evolving master narrative. But at any given moment, the entire Sandai project, was, and that's what you outlined yourself, was to establish a kind of new master narrative.
Yeah, but that's, see, the Sandai Gongchang, I think, actually does, because there was perhaps this evolving master narrative of multi-regionalism in terms of the Chinese origins of Chinese civilization that relates to Tong and Zhen's position, but also Su Bingqi and Casey Zhang as well here at Harvard. But the Sandai Gongchang is very much hearkening back to the central position of the Central Plains and the story there. And now both, as you see in this paper from Science, which is basically trying to reinforce some components of the old master narrative, that there in and of itself shows that there are two antagonistic master narratives, and there are actually more, I think. So I think that you can take multiple positions as to what the really fundamental processes were and still be on solid ground and not be in a bit of politically dangerous territory. And so that's why I don't think that there's these major kind of politically sensitive positions one can take.
We're going to get a couple more questions. So Mike Soni and Paul Rao.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Michael Soni. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center. Thank you for another hugely stimulating panel. I'm going to ask the question that I perhaps may ask about every panel, which is, what is the Zhongguo Tese? By which I mean that the integration of history, archaeology, literature with politics, the manipulation of historical, philosophical, literary arguments for political purposes is probably universal in human societies. And I could find, I think, an analog to each of your presentations in the world in which we live. And I'll just mention very quickly one that I think is a sort of counterpoint to Rudolph's comment that about the manipulation of the Confucian tradition, the great principles of the founding fathers of the United States, the principles of liberalism and freedom and rights, are, as Greg Grandin has shown recently in his book Empire of Necessity, profoundly shaped by the assertion of the right and freedom to purchase and sell other human beings, something that is left out of the way in which that narrative is used in most of American political life and American textbooks, for that matter. So, obviously, the political systems are different. There are greater levels of control in China, and the levels of control are changing, as came up earlier. But where is the Zhongguo Tese in the way politics, literary studies, and history interact in China today?
And Paul, if you would. Thank you.
I'm Paul Ropp from Clark University and a research associate at the Fairbanks Center. A question for Mark. How has your notoriety affected your access both to scholars, your relationships with individuals in China, and your access to archives? Are there scholars in China who will privately cheer you on, or is everyone too scared to do that?
So I'll answer this question because it's a minor question, at least compared to Michael Soni's question. I think certainly easier to answer. In fact, I think that, well, I could say this: if it were not for the very strong and mostly negative response in China to the new Qing history, there would be no new Qing history. When I've not had any trouble with access, knock on wood, I receive invitations to attend conferences in China all the time. I unfortunately can't go to as many of them as I'd like. And I find that there is a lot of interest and a lot of openness, particularly among graduate students, wherever I travel in China, to just learn more about this. Not at all. I think that there is, Jing has pointed to this as well. There's tremendous hunger for new ideas, and people are very clever and anxious for theories and ways that they can take what they know and how they're understanding the world and do important things with it. And they're masters at figuring out how far they can go and what language to use and all the rest. So I'm not worried about that really so much.
Answer to Michael's question.
It is kind of, I guess. But I'm going to maybe just we can go down the line here. Where is the 中国特色 in the kinds of things that you've been talking about? And I suppose the possible answer is there is no 中国特色. 中国特色 itself is a 神话.
That's unable already.
As an anthropologist, I think that the answer to that question always is that it related to context, in that the big questions, the big issues that we're discussing in terms of the way that history is enacted relate to kind of human behaviors that have some degree of universal properties, but that they are situated in a particular historical and geographical space. And that I think that the important and salient issues related to not just archaeology, but I hear from the other presenters this kind of repeated, relate to top-down government investment in certain practices and the effects that has on, right now, on the way, on the questions that are most supported, if not exclusively available to research, that are being most supported with resources and so forth, and at very considerable scales, and that has a considerable impact on the questions being asked, how the results are being disseminated, and so forth. And to repeat something I said at the end of my comments before, the publication processes and how that's being changing quite recently in terms of expectations within the academy of academic research, where are acceptable publication locales, the demands on academics to publish at a certain rate, which results in academic articles being repeated in multiple venues as well, because people have to do that to keep their jobs, and to some extent, and also the effect that has on the depth with which a particular question can be examined at the expense of examining a bunch of different questions at a much more shallow depth.
I think there is a danger about 中国特色, not because Chinese exceptionalism aggrandizes a sense of national sovereignty or power, but I think it actually closes down a lot of conversations and thinking about China as being a state actor, not unlike any other, with the amount of resource, with the kind of history, right? In some ways, and I also don't want to take the bait of getting into a conversation about what is 中国特色, and yes, and this, or this, like get into a conversation about Chineseness. It's endless, and you can generate zillions of conferences and conference volumes, monographs out of it. But in the end, it just becomes very kind of self-involved. And I think it is much more important for me not to think of exceptionalism that way, but as what is China doing that, like, whether it's from perspective archaeology or re-narrating history, or rethinking of its sort of present empire, trying to impose a kind of new worldview, that is, should be seen soberly and not through the scare lens of something that's uniquely China.
Rudy.
Yeah. Well, it looks as if 中国特色 is a positive concept. That what you did, what's the content of it? In fact, it is the opposite. It's a negative concept. The 中国特色 is we are not what the general Marxism, Leninism, socialism, whatever it is. We have a Zhongguo Tese. That's a kind of a, so it's basically a defensive concept which has a function. It is not, it is essentially a government concept, and it has a function to free the space for the government to do things which, on the principle to which they subscribe, are out of bounds. Whether it's socialism, capitalism, whatever you want, you know. So essentially, it's a defensive a concept which says, well, most of the stuff, yes, we go along, but we have our Zhongguo Tese, so there we have a space of where we do our own thing, which is then going according to a logic we ourselves define. Now, this is a part of a subsection of a larger problem. You see, I mean, you look at 19th and 20th century history, you go earlier, it's the same thing, but I mean, there it's more pronounced. You have, you know, you can make a simple sentence which is saying, you know, Chinese culture, like any other culture, the lifeline of it is transcultural interaction. Every Chinese language, a word you're using today, you know, is either of a Buddhist origin, of an English origin, or a Japanese origin. I mean, I've marked that on a Renmin Ruba editorial. You know, it is quite overwhelming. Now 80% of the stuff becomes marked. You know, so you think this is the Zhongguo Hua. You know, this is wonderful. You know, but in German it's the same thing. You know, you do with the German text. You know, they all come from French and Latin and English and so on. So it's a perfectly normal affair. You go with English, the same thing. They all come from French. You know, so this is nothing extraordinary. But culture has a second function, which is anchoring identity, and the two conflict. And so what you do is to do number one, take whatever is useful, and number two, deny you ever did. And this is exactly this problem here, you know. So you have a kind of a Zhongguo is joining the world, and at the same time, you know, it is then saying, yes, we have our 5,000-year history, you know, we have our Chinese language, you have our Chinese literature. You know, you open Moyen and you read Marquez every single line, you know. So this is all, you know, a nice confident story, you know. But I think this tension there, you know, is very clearly in the effort of the government to get out of anybody like you coming in and say, well, you know, I know what capitalism works like. What you're doing is not that. You know, they say we have Zhongguo Tese, you know, so these rules don't apply for us. You know, so it's a defensive concept, you know, which allows them to take whatever they want and claiming identity at the same time.
Michael, I'll just offer last response. I certainly agree that this kind of manipulation, uses of the past, language and so forth, happens all the time. We see it every day on the television and on the internet, right? So what's unique about it? And you know, there's really not anything unique about it, I don't think. I think that the real question is what gets done with it, and what power does it have then in the public space? And I think there is a real difference in the sense that you can read a book by Greg Grandin that opens all of this up for question and takes it to task, and it can be published. Such a book cannot be published in China. Not right now, not very easily anyway. And that, I think, marks a big difference and makes it a very challenging environment for our academic colleagues in China to do their work. And that they are able to do the excellent work that they do, despite all of those challenges, I think is a testament to the dedication that they have to this great tradition that they are the heirs to, and that we get to participate a little bit in on the sides. So I think with that we are definitely over time, and we will stop. I would like to thank Rudy, Jing, and Rowan